Hi, folks. Welcome to Israel Explained. I'm your host, Ben-Ephraim. So it's gotten a lot of press that U.S. Israel relations have reached what many are describing as a new low, at least in recent years, when Biden admitted something that we've already known for a few days, that the United States is holding up at least one major shipment of ammunition to Israel because it doesn't want Israel to use it on the major population centers in Rafah. So there's been a lot of disinformation around this. So let's first make clear what it is that he did say. He said the U.S. is holding up just that one shipment for now, not all arms, though he didn't rule out holding up further shipments in the future. That shipment is not part of the congressional approval of weapons. It's a previous White House approved one that was published in the Washington Post a couple of months ago. So otherwise, weapons will be provided until further notice. It was surprising how publicly and clearly he put it in an interview to CNN. So Biden said, quote, if they go into Rafah, I'm not supplying the weapons that have been historically used to deal with Rafah, which is a mistake, to deal with the cities, end quote. And I think what he's talking about there is how Israel has used weapons that were quite large to bomb urban centers in Gaza in previous operations. I believe he's also alluding to bombings in Rafah in the last few days that have killed several Palestinian civilians. What he's publicly saying is that he's waving a red flag at a large entry into Rafah, not at other operations. So, as I said in the previous episode, he did green light the move towards the Rafah crossing. He hasn't ruled out other operations, and Israel has been fighting in northern Gaza and in central Gaza since, without the United States addressing that. So this is a pretty limited move that the Biden administration is making. However, that certainly doesn't obscure its importance. Holding up arms is often seen as a last measure that the U.S. only uses occasionally, like Reagan used it with the F-16s. It also happened not publicly, by the way, in the 1973 war. So this will happen occasionally, but it's considered to be a major escalation. John Kirby addressed it more clearly than Biden did in the interview. He said, quote, I believe Israel has put an enormous amount of pressure on Hamas and that there are better ways to go after what is left of Hamas in Rafah than a major ground operation. He was also saying that Hamas has been degraded so much that there's no need for that operation and possibly no need for those big bombs. He said, quote, early on in the conflict, Hamas didn't feel and hadn't suffered the kinds of pressure and the kinds of casualties they have suffered now. Israel has eliminated a lot of the leaders through the fighting that they have conducted over the last several months. They have decimated the ranks of many of their units. The picture of Hamas today is not what it was 6 months ago. Then there was something else that was very interesting that Kirby said. He was also encouraging Israel to advance, quote, an alternative governance structure to Hamas. And that raises the intriguing possibility that Israel could make concessions on that and in return get the hold on the weapons withdrawn, which in my opinion would be good for Israeli interests to begin with. Now, the Israeli government isn't particularly concerned, and the military isn't particularly concerned about the military repercussions of all this, right? The IDF spokesman, Hagari, said that the U.S. has all of the arms and ammunition that it needs for the operation. And what I'm hearing from sources in the military is that that's true, but they will start running low on those specific bombs soon, and they'll have to either find alternatives or they'll have to use what they call kalkalat chimushim, which is using these forms of ammunition more sparingly. So what Daniel Hagari, the spokesperson for the IDF, said is, quote, we have the ammunition we need for all our operations, including in Rafah. But the Israelis are very concerned about this announcement, not so much because of the immediate operational effects, which, as I said, would be negligible, possibly not even felt, but rather because there's a fear that this will embolden Hamas, especially in the negotiations over the hostages. Indeed, the latest round of negotiations has gone very badly. Um, Bill Burns and the Hamas representatives have left Cairo without any agreement. Some say it's because of the Israeli operation in Rafah. Some Israelis think it's because of what Biden said now holding up the arms. And other people said that it's just because the gaps between Hamas and Israel are so wide. Certainly, there are a lot of reasons that these talks are not succeeding. I don't think they would be succeeding anyway. So Israelis have generally reacted publicly very defiantly. The most defiant by far, of course, as usual, was Itamar Ben-Gvir, who quipped, "Hamas loves Biden" on Twitter with a nice little heart emoji. The more normal people in the Israeli government also reacted with defiance, but more polite, diplomatic defiance. Like, for example, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant said, quote, "I say from here to Israel's enemies and best friends, the state of Israel cannot be subdued, not the IDF, not the defense ministry, not the defense establishment, not the state of Israel. We will stand, we will achieve our goals, we will hit Hamas, we will destroy Hezbollah, and we will bring security." Meanwhile, Netanyahu said, "If we need to fight alone, we will fight alone. And if we need to fight with our fingernails, we will." In other words, if we don't have any weapons, we'll fight with our bare hands. But he also continued, "We have a lot more than the fingernails, and we will continue to fight." An official told the Times of Israel that when Netanyahu said Israel would fight tooth and nail if it has to, he meant it. So publicly, Israel is saying that this will not affect anything at all. And that's what they should be saying, because the problem with Biden's statement, and I want to be very clear that I'm very much against Biden's statement. Holding up the arms on its own had some advantages in terms of pro- providing leverage over the Israeli operation, but announcing it really shows that the United States is not fully in support of Israel and weakens Israel's hand in negotiating and in the military operation. Excuse me. So I'm very much against that. And Israel should be showing that that's not going to influence their strategic calculus. But um, Israel can't really afford to fully ignore that. The cabinets are meeting tonight, both the full ministerial cabinet, which is more of a political forum that a lot of things tend to get leaked from, and the more narrow war cabinet, which is where the actual decisions are made, and usually, not always, there aren't leaks. They're going to be talking about how to take this into account, and they will take it into account. Um, and we'll see how deeply they take it into account. The IDF, Mossad, and Shabak are going into these talks today with the cabinet, and they will be recommending that entering Rafah should be accompanied by a clear day after plan. They think that A, it's the right thing to do strategically, and B, it will ameliorate U.S. pressure. And I think, of course, that they're correct. The problem, of course, being that if Israel takes Rafah, they still won't be in a position to enact a day after plan. And it's not clear that the U.S. will allow Israel with the room that it needs to do so, which would involve taking over um, the areas in the Gaza Strip that they have taken back. But they're recommending that Israel do that, even if only in order to have something to show to the Americans. So they're going to recommend that Israel has a clearer plan to evacuate civilians from Rafah, and a day after, thinking that will help a lot with American objections and can be traded for the provision of these ammunitions and no more of these statements, because Israel can't afford more of the statements like Biden has given. So they're going to recommend that the levels of the antagonism towards the United States be lowered significantly. But Netanyahu has a different calculus. For Netanyahu, fighting against a American administration that is unpopular in Israel and showing that he's standing up to them is a position that he's most comfortable in, far more comfortable than he is in fighting a war, for example. And the fact that Biden has been quite supportive of Israel throughout most of this war hasn't helped him at all. But now, as things are getting worse between Israel and the United States, and as the war continues to drag on, Netanyahu is managing to rebound in the polls. So early in the war, his bloc was measuring about 40 something mandates in the polls, in the low 40s. And of course, you need over 60 to control. According to the latest polls, his bloc is up to 54. That's within reach of the 61 that he needs. He's hoping if he can provoke Biden into a big fight, he will be the big beneficiary of that and he will get over 60. Because remember, the more popular the right wing is, and the more the right wing resists Biden, the better it is for him. It doesn't only have to be for him, because his bloc also includes Ben-Gvir. So when Ben-Gvir tweets things like Hamas loves Biden, and Netanyahu also fights against Biden, they take mandates from elsewhere. And that's very good for him. He might want this kind of tension to continue for electoral reasons. Now, there's been a lot of talk about how Biden is doing this for electoral reasons, but for him, the calculus is actually a lot less clear. There certainly is an argument to be made that if the war ends, it will be much better for his electoral prospects. I think that's inarguable. But if he's seen as betraying Israel in the process, that will really hurt him, not only with Jewish voters, but also with a lot of centrist voters. I think one of the most important demographics, if not the most important demographic, that Biden needs to win over in order to win the elections are Nikki Haley voters. They are generally grouped in the suburbs, more conservative, but conservative in the old-fashioned sense, where they're against the changes that Trump is trying to make in the country. They're against what the changes the radical left is trying to make in the country. If Biden wants to win them, seeming to surrender to the protesters on the campuses and to not support Hamas is actually not a good electoral strategy. And he's also had some pushback from large Jewish donors like Chaim Saban as well. So for him, the calculus is very muddled, which is one of the reasons I think he's generally following a policy that I think is more foreign policy oriented than domestic oriented, because there is no clear foreign policy. There's no clear domestic policy win here for him electorally. He can't really win back the anti um, Israel protesters or the pro Hamas protesters. He can't really win back people who think that Israel's committing genocide because they call him Genocide Joe. So there's a limit to how much pressuring Israel will get him. Of course, Michigan is an issue, but so are Jewish donors, so are Jewish voters, and so are Nikki Haley voters. What I'm hearing from Israeli experts about what's happening now from a strategic point of view is that a lot of people who were against the entry into Rafah before Biden made this unfortunate announcement are now for it. And the reason being that if Israel doesn't go through with the invasion of Rafah now, it will look like the U.S. neutered it. And if Israel seems neutered, that will damage them at the bargaining table, that will embolden Hamas, that will embolden Iran, that will embolden Hezbollah. So some people are starting to think Israel should defy the United States just in order to defy the United States, even though they don't necessarily agree that operation in Rafah would serve Israeli interests. And they don't agree with Netanyahu's drive to seemingly keep this war going for a very long time. An Israeli source I talked to told me we're in a serious bind. There isn't a clear way out. Backing down now will embarrass Israel. Continuing the operation will lead Israel into further sanctions and issues like that. So it could be that the fact that Israel's been cornered like this might paradoxically make it more likely for the IDF to go in. But other sources that talk to Ynet, diplomatic sources, said that they're hopeful. They believe the Biden administration is surprised by the extent of the backlash to that announcement. They didn't expect it to make the headlines of every news edition in Israel, the United States, and many other countries. They didn't expect this kind of backlash from Jewish donors and voters, and now they would like to minimize the crisis. Hopefully, That's true, because the current schism doesn't serve anyone but Hamas. However, even if Israel starts to move to ameliorate this conflict with the U.S., there are new fronts that are being opened right now between the U.S. and Israel, both involving um, Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich. Smotrich said, A, he refuses to hand over tax money to the PA and said he plans to allocate money for new construction in the West Bank. Both of those things. Two things that will harm U.S. relations with the United States. And the question becomes, does Netanyahu want to exacerbate these and say, we're doing this because we're independent and we're standing up to Biden, or will he try to ameliorate them? It looks to me like he might have some motive right now to back Smotrich. Smotrich is doing this because he's disappearing and Ben-Gvir is taking all his votes, so he's trying to get attention. Netanyahu might back this so that he can get support for standing up to Biden. So there's some real issues at play here that might actually exacerbate this, and there are some actors who might want to exacerbate this. One of my Twitter followers asked me to talk about the famous quote where Menachem Begin said that I am not a Jew with trembling knees to Joe Biden back in the early 1980s. Excuse me. Now, interestingly enough, um, I wrote about this in a book I have coming out later this year. So, first self plug for the book. The book will be coming out. And I actually brought this in there. It was in my PhD dissertation too, before it got mainstream attention. So I can tell you that the quote is actually not accurate. It was seriously embellished by people for various political reasons. Here's the actual quote. So when at the time, Menachem Begin was expanding settlement construction in the West Bank. Joe Biden, who was a pro-Israel young Democratic senator from Delaware at the time, in a meeting between legislators and Prime Minister Begin, said the following: "There's an erosion of support for Israel in Congress. You're not loved for your actions. Israeli policy in the occupied territories is causing damage. And if settlement construction continues, Israel will not get 50 votes in the Senate in favor of aid. Many of my colleagues are too polite and will not talk to your face. But in the locker room, they will." End quote. This got Begin very angry. And he replied, "I am as proud as you are. I do not shake. We will stand by our principles and accept the cutoff of American aid." End quote. So the trembling knees wasn't there. The long speech about thousands of years, etc., wasn't there. But there is a germ of reality in that story, and I just read you what it is. Of course, what's interesting is that Joe Biden, of course, was 100% correct. In my opinion, of course, he was warning Begin at the time that the settlements that he was constructing would end up harming Israeli interests, harming U.S. support for Israel by ultimately blocking the road to a Palestinian state, to a two-state solution, and that is exactly what has happened. So Biden, in that particular event, was giving Israel very good advice: stop building settlements in the West Bank. Just like in this war, he's given Israel a lot of good advice, like stop the war after 3 months or so, like create a day after plan, like bring in all the aid that is needed from the beginning. All these sorts of things that would have made this war go by much better, like come to an agreement with the Saudis, the UAE, and Egypt, and move towards a two-state solution. So Biden has been correct about this conflict for a very long time. And even in the famous case where Begin was standing up ferociously against him, Begin was in the wrong. What Begin was defending was his drive to create um, settlements that would incorporate all of the West Bank into Israel, a problem that Israel is still facing today and has no solution to. So, listening to Biden's advice might not have been the worst thing in the world. Anyway, I have some questions from you. Ratchard Guyman asks, so what happens if and when Hamas says all the hostages are dead? So, first of all the hostages are not dead. We had proof of life of a few of them a few days ago. Israeli intelligence thinks that maybe about half of them are alive, hopefully more. So that's not true. Even if it was true, I don't think Hamas would say all the hostages are dead. They would probably try to continue the pretense that they were alive so that they at least can have some leverage over Israel. Because basically, what's keeping Sinwar alive at this point are the hostages. Israel knows more or less where it is, and it could just bomb the bejesus out of those areas. It doesn't do it because they know that he's with a bunch of hostages. I heard one estimate say he's with about 20 hostages, like personally with 20 hostages. And many hostages have reported meeting Sinwar before they were released. So I don't think that's happening. But even if it was, they would lie about it. Because if they said all the hostages are dead, I think the call for vengeance and the restraints that have been on Israel from the families of the hostages would disappear. And that's not something that Sinwar wants. Aliyah Aloha says, do you think the negotiations will involve Israel keeping the Philadelphia route and the Rafah crossing? So I think that this is a great bargaining point for Israel. Israel has the Rafah crossing now. It can control what comes in to Hamas, and it should definitely not give it that up unless all the hostages are coming back, or even then, it's a great thing to have. So I think there's no reason for Israel to give it up until there's serious quid pro quo for it. Another question. With the Biden administration announcing there was a deal, feeling proud about it, all that was in that Axios article had me feeling very comfortable about them and the possibility Israel might have been tipped off by someone in Qatar versus someone in the Biden administration. Fortunately, it worked out because of Israel taking the Rafah crossing, yet I feel a form of yikes. So I think what Aliyah's asking here is, was the U.S. involved in that offer that Hamas accepted? And the answer to that is probably that the Biden administration was aware of that, like they're aware of a lot of back and forth, but it doesn't appear they were aware of the fact that Hamas was going to all of a sudden accept that. And therefore, that's why they didn't warn Israel about that. Sunny LaBouffe asks, is it fair to say that the government and or military have entirely abandoned the idea of unseating Hamas? Even if we get some kind of hostage deal that doesn't officially end the war, do you think it's at all feasible that we could resume hostilities in a few months' time and finally pursue those ends? I have a hard time believing any Israeli administration would have the domestic or international political capital to restart such a disastrous war after everyone has gotten used to it being over. Yeah, so Sunny, you hit on a very sensitive and prescient point. Israeli spokespeople and politicians are constantly saying, we can renew this war after a deal is made. And we will not sign the deal unless we can renew the war and all those sorts of things. Some people are even saying we can sign a deal and then much later go back. I think that they're kidding themselves. I think that the momentum that Israel had for changing the government in Gaza was real. They had support for it and they blew it. It's now gone. And to make things worse, Israel doesn't even have a plan to replace Hamas. So they can't even say to people, look, if you just give us a couple more months, we'll do this, because they don't have a plan. So it's really hard to see how Israel ever gets that support again. They haven't given it up, but I think they're lying to themselves. So, Netanyahu will say we're one step away from destroying Hamas and things like that. And the military keeps insisting that they come up with a day after plan. And they'll be insisting on that in the meeting in the cabinet tonight as we speak. So it's not that they've given up, but I think it's unrealistic at this point. There's no plan, there's no support. I don't see it happening. I agree with you, but expect to continue to hear Israelis saying that. I just don't think that they can do that. I think they're lying to themselves, and they probably know it. Jose Roche says, are you excited the IDF is finally going into Rafah? So let me just stop you there. Nothing in this war excites me. Is this surprising to you that they're finally taking your advice? A few weeks ago, you had a very bleak view of the future success of the war. How are you thinking about it now? I know you gave a more nuanced view than the IDF just invading Rafah, etc. Yeah. So I am a big supporter of that operation of taking the Rafah crossing. I've been a big supporter of a Rafah invasion for a long time, but I'm really not so sure anymore. I Two reasons for that. There's a high price you're going to pay with U.S. support, and it's not clear how that actually leads to um, a victory, how that leads to replacing Hamas. If I saw a more clear link between the two, it would be easier to support. So excited is definitely the wrong word. I think that the operation Israel done so far was a great idea. It might be better at this point to not defy the United States, surround Rafah, completely surround Rafah, do various targeted assassinations in Rafah, which the U.S. is fine with, and expand Israeli military operations elsewhere, where the U.S. hasn't put this red flag, like Khan Yunis, like back in the north, all while negotiating with Hamas. I think that if Israel's firm enough with that, they can overcome some of the damage that has occurred from the U.S. distancing themselves from Israel by showing that they're determined and all that without causing that break with the U.S. So I think that's probably the best move that Israel has, not going into Rafah now. ND asks, wouldn't it be wise for Israel to consolidate their territorial gains in and around Rafah, meaning setting up humanitarian zones in each part they secure? Maybe this is what they're doing. Now that Israel controls Rafah, they can control what goes, the Rafah crossing, they can control what goes in and out of it. Then when Hamas fires on those humanitarian zones, public sentiment may well shift. Yeah, you're pretty much where I am. I think that if Israel surrounds Rafah, does operations in Rafah, which the U.S. approves of, expands elsewhere, it will eventually gain the upper hand in the negotiations, at least more than it has now. Going in might paradoxically cause a break with the U.S., which would actually lessen the Israeli position. Controlling what goes in and out of Rafah is already a very good first step that gives Israel some leverage. John Price asks, do you think the whole Gaza-Egypt operation will be green-lighted if the deal doesn't come? So I don't think anything is going to be green-lighted um, if a deal doesn't come, because I think the U.S. really wants right now for Israel to accept a deal, not necessarily the current deal, which they don't see as viable, but to work towards accepting something at the negotiating table. So nothing's going to greenlight Rafah. I think Rafah has become such a symbol at this point that it's lost to Israel, at least lost in terms of doing it with American approval. Okay, so that's it for our episode today. If you like what I do here, consider supporting me on Patreon. I also am working on a new episode of the History of the Land of Israel podcast, so look out for that. And I'm sure I will see you here again very soon.